The executioner stood over the condemned man with a heavy iron hammer and shattered his right arm just above the elbow. Then, he swung again, snapping the bone just below the joint. Medieval European justice had a very specific idea about punishment. The worse the crime, the longer you should take to die. And ideally, the whole town should watch. First, guards bound the condemned to a wooden board. A horse dragged him to the public execution site. The Zurich Blood Court procedures from the 15th century spell out exactly how a wheel execution should go, down to the number of blows and where each one lands. 9 strikes total. 2 on each arm, 2 on each leg, and a final one on the spine. The purpose of that final strike was to sever the spinal cord. It paralyzed the victim so they couldn't thrash around for the next step, because breaking the bones was only the beginning. The origins of this device stretch back to antiquity. The ancient Roman Emperor Commodus rolled, spiked wheels over the bodies of slaves and Christians as they lay bound to wooden benches. But the Middle Ages refined the practice into a highly systematic public spectacle. The 13th century German legal code, known as the Sachsenspiegel, specifically prescribed the wheel for unprovoked murder and arson. Judges designed it as a mirror punishment, returning the extreme violence of the crime directly onto the criminal's body. Executioners realized early on that human bone is surprisingly resilient. If you swing a heavy iron bar at a leg resting flat on the ground, the earth absorbs the kinetic energy. The bone cracks, but it doesn't shatter cleanly. Someone sat down and solved that problem. Guards started placing sharp-edged wooden wedges directly under the victim's joints. They slipped blocks under the wrists, the elbows, the knees, and the ankles. This created an empty gap of air beneath the middle of the long bones. When the iron hammer came down over that gap, the limb had nowhere to yield. The bone took the entire force of the blow. The executioner systematically worked his way through the body's largest bones: the femur, the tibia, the radius, the ulna. Each bone was crushed into fragments. The blows were precisely placed to pulverize bone without hitting vital organs. A strike to the ribs could puncture a lung. A strike to the head would cause unconsciousness. The justice system demanded that the victim stay awake for the entire process. In some regions, the executioner didn't use a hammer at all. They used the wheel itself as the blunt instrument. During the 1589 execution of Franz Seubelt in Nuremberg, guards placed wooden blocks under his limbs. Then, the executioner repeatedly slammed a heavy wooden wagon wheel down onto Seubelt's arms and legs. Once the bones were pulverized, the limbs became horribly flexible. The arms and legs bent like lengths of heavy rope. The executioner then brought out a large wooden cartwheel. They picked up the broken body and physically wove it through the spokes. An arm was threaded over one spoke and under the next. A leg was twisted backward and laced through the wooden gaps. The shattered spine allowed the torso to bend backward over the central hub. The executioner literally braided the victim into the wheel. Then, guards hoisted the wheel into the air and mounted it horizontally on top of a tall wooden pole. They planted the pole firmly in the ground at the center of the town square for public display. The pole suspended the victim 10 feet in the air, fully conscious, with every major limb destroyed. Death didn't come quickly. Without major arteries severed, blood loss was minimal. Victims simply hung there in the sun while birds began to land on the wood. They sometimes survived for days up there. In 1348, authorities recorded a man who remained conscious on a wheel for 4 full days and nights. Other criminals faced even more extreme sentences. In France, executioners often rotated the wheel while the prisoners were affixed to the outer perimeter, striking them with a cudgel as they went around. In 1581, a judge convicted a German serial killer named Peter Neers of over 500 murders. The judge ordered an extended sequence of torture. Guards strapped Neers to the breaking wheel, and he endured 42 separate strikes. Executioners deliberately kept him alive during the ordeal. The sheer length of the dying process was the point. For standard cases, dehydration and shock eventually stopped the heart. But the courts did have a system for shortening the ordeal. Depending on the exact severity of the crime, a judge could order a mercy blow. The French called this the coup de grâce. The court sentence specified exactly when this blow should happen. Sometimes a judge ordered it immediately after the first few limb strikes. The executioner would swing the hammer directly into the victim's chest, crushing the heart. But for the absolute worst crimes, there was no mercy. Parricides were people who murdered their own parents. For them, the sentence mandated limb strikes only. This guaranteed the victim would have to die entirely from exposure. The court engineered the longest possible dying process. This extreme method of execution spread far beyond the borders of medieval Europe. French and British colonists brought the practice to the Americas. In 1712, a group of enslaved Africans in New York City launched an armed rebellion. The colonial government crushed the uprising and handed down horrific sentences. A judge sentenced one rebel slave to the wheel. Guards tied him to the wooden spokes without food or water until he died. In Europe, the practice persisted straight into the 18th century. The wheel was a common sight across Germany, France, and the Netherlands. As late as October 1st, 1786, a man named Heinrich Dahl faced the wheel in the German county of Tecklenburg. A judge convicted him of aggravated murder. The court ordered the executioner to break him from the top down. This meant the very first strike was supposed to crush his chest and kill him instantly. The court even secretly instructed the executioner to strangle Dahl with a garrote before the wheel was used. They wanted the public spectacle of the wheel without the prolonged torture. But the executioner, a man named Esmeyer, botched the strangulation. The cord wasn't tight enough. The crowd watched in horror as Dahl remained alive and screaming while his bones were broken. The public backlash was severe. A judge actually took the executioner to court for malpractice. It was one of the last recorded uses of the breaking wheel in history. The device was so deeply embedded in European culture that it even infiltrated religion. Saint Catherine of Alexandria was an early Christian martyr. According to her legend, the Romans sentenced her to be broken on a spiked wheel. But when she touched the wood, the device miraculously shattered. Classical painters depicted her standing next to a ruined wooden wheel. This story became so popular that the torture device earned an alternate name. It became known as the Catherine wheel. You can still see the broken wheel on the coats of arms of towns across Europe. For centuries, modern historians relied on trial records and woodcut illustrations to understand the process. The bones of executed criminals were usually left exposed to the elements or tossed into mass graves. Finding physical evidence of the wheel is exceptionally rare. But in 2019, an archaeological dig at San Ambrogio Square in northern Italy uncovered a medieval skeleton. Archaeologists discovered him alongside 56 other skeletons, but his injuries stood out immediately. Researchers unearthed the remains of a young man buried between the years 1290 and 1430. He was between 17 and 20 years old. His bones bore the unmistakable signature of the breaking wheel. Forensic anthropologists mapped the fractures. All the long bones in his forearms and lower legs were shattered. The breaks were completely perpendicular. The iron weapon struck the bone at a perfect 90-degree angle. And the injuries were perfectly symmetrical on both the left and right sides of his body. These weren't battle wounds. In combat, people raised their arms to defend themselves, resulting in chaotic, asymmetrical fractures. Guards immobilized this young man, and the executioner broke his bones deliberately. The skeleton also showed a deep stab wound in the vertebrae. At the base of his skull, there was a massive fracture from a heavy, sharp weapon. Researchers believe this was a clumsy, botched attempt to decapitate him at the end of his ordeal. In northern Italy at the time, courts heavily utilized this extreme level of punishment for one specific crime. They used it on people suspected of being plague spreaders. An angry crowd likely targeted the young man, blaming him for the sickness in their city. When the execution was finally over, nobody removed the body from the wheel. Nobody came to cut the ropes or pull the broken limbs from the spokes. The executioner simply walked away. Leaving the body up there to rot was the final stage of the punishment.